right, before you begin, I guess I'll just say a little something. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out. Welcome to this is our, what?
Oh, no, I'm talking to
Oh,
myself.
that's okay. We all do.
Go Luna.
Our monthly tefillah series in memory of Dr. Jody Tobin. And we would like to dedicate this evening also to the refuah shlema of Yaakov Simcha ben Masha Varda. Before we begin, I have two announcements. Starting Sunday night will be a somewhat monthly shiur in Neve Shamir. So for those of you who want to travel all the way over there, for those of you who are already from Ramat Beit Shemesh and want to go a little bit that way, it's an evening shiur with Shani Targin, an in-depth series on Akedat Yitzchak. It'll be, I'm going to say once a month, but it's not really. It's basically once a month. You'll see on the website. Also, we're doing a new initiative called Open New Chapters, where we are trying to house the bookshelves of our current Beit Midrash and our future Beit Midrash at the same time, with which is very appropriate, with books written by women. We've been housed here in Netzach for, I'm going to say 20 something years. Wow. I guess. And they just redid their Beit Midrash, and they approached me about helping fill the bookshelves with books written by women. And I came up with this huge list. So I pared it down a little bit. And we thought that maybe what we would love to do is be able to have books for our current Beit Midrash, and then also for our future Beit Midrash that we're building. So B'ezras Hashem. So I'll have in the back a thing you can scan if you want to look at the options. This is not yet on the list, so if anyone wants to add it, and we can put it there, that would be great. And I'm very excited. Those were my two announcements. It is my pleasure to welcome the Nashir people. Oh, they're not a day without all three of you. I've perused the book a lot. I haven't read all of it yet, but I'm
very hard to do.
Yeah, you have to, it's a bit in pieces. It's like
This is not a beach book.
Table, right? You leave it on the coffee table, and then you pick it up when you have, you're in the
Something to daven for.
right, exactly. When you need some inspiration, or so I'm happy to have Shira, I have the names are all here. Yeah. Shira Lincoln Chaps, Rachel Sharansky Danziger, and Ann Gordon, who are here to represent the book and to give us an evening to learn a lot. And I'm excited. Very happy to have you here. You can introduce yourselves.
We're very excited to be here. We have, I think, a few different segments of the evening. We'd like to start with a tefillah written by Miriam Friedman, who's sitting amongst you, because she wrote for the hostages, and we feel we can't really do anything these days without first praying for the hostages. So, if you will honor
And Miriam,
us.
you should know that we actually open most of our events with your tefillah. Yeah, so it's a real honor for us to be able to have you read it.
Thank you. I actually wrote this in for Rosh Chodesh Nisan, so it's actually horrible that.
Yeah.
So we're still saying it.
Before you begin, I'm just going to bother you.
Okay. Dear God, full of mercy, I lay my broken, yellow ribboned heart at your feet. I fear that any move we humans make will be a grotesque misstep. We are drowning in the devil's arithmetic. Have we ever needed a miracle more than at this moment? With my tiny and insignificant voice, I make my own decree. It's time for you to come out of hiding. Give us a miracle. You can split the sea, then you can split those tunnels. Bring our sisters and brothers out whole. Drown their captors in the rubble. Gather them up from their cells, scattered among the four corners of Gaza, like you gathered us up from the four corners of the earth and brought us home to your land. Bring them home with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Carry them on the wings of eagles to the embrace of their families, to the embrace of their nation, to the embrace of their land. I want to hug each one, kiss their heads as I bow mine, entering a time of true freedom together.
Amen. Melissa, do I need to move this now?
You could put it back over here. Yeah, that'd be good. It's fine.
Okay. So we know that some of you may have indeed read this book cover to cover, and some of you maybe don't know what it is yet. So we're going to later in the evening have a little bit of discussion of the Torah that comes out of this book. But first, we have discussion of what went into this book. So I think we've engineered a conversation for you. So I'm going to start.
Supposed to say that.
So Shira, I'm actually going to start with you, and this is where we would start, engineered or not, because this was your brainchild, and we very quickly came along for the ride. But how did this start? Where did it come from? Give us the background so that people who don't know what Az Nashir is now will.
So Az Nashir was born on Shvi Shel Pesach, on the 7th day of Pesach. We had just all survived the first Iranian attack, and I don't know about all of you, but it was a very shocking experience for me. I thought that I would be terrified during that experience, and I remember walking out of the bomb shelter after 20 minutes, and all these nisim had occurred, and I remember just walking out feeling this whole like renewed sense of faith and a renewed sense of where we were and what was happening. And I remember Seder that year, this past year, my father like got to Kadesh or Chat, and I was like already crying. I just never felt the Seder as real, as current, like our experience of exile and redemption and miracle as present and as I did on that night. And so on the seventh day of Pesach, I had a couple of days to percolate on it. And I woke up with what I like to call a divine download, which is basically what I experience when an entire idea just kind of comes into my head. And it doesn't really feel like it's my idea. It feels like it's like a HaKadosh Baruch Hu idea. And it's like, do this, you need to do this. And so I had this vision of a book of tefillot, tchinot, and piyutim written by women for women in response to the war. My own practice kind of led us to this place. I had been writing a novel for several years, and I'm committed to finishing it. And one of my characters writes tchinot. But tchinot, many of you don't know, are it's a tefillah that is written can be by a man or by a woman, but typically it's by women in our own Mama Lashon. Because what happened as early as early 1600s in Prague, they were publishing these. Women didn't speak or read or write in Hebrew and Aramaic, which is the language of our prayer and our liturgy. And so if you gave a woman a siddur and you said, pray from your heart, how? If you don't understand what you're saying. And so women literally started writing their own tefillot. So they would write things like a tefillah for when my son is having a brit milah, a tefillah for rising of my bread, a tefillah for going to the mikvah. And these weren't canonized, in the way that we experience tefillot today. But I know certainly in my family, we have an old yellowed leather-bound book of my family's from Prague for 5 generations, and we have tchinot that were said by many generations of family of women in my family. And so a couple of years ago, I started my own practice of writing tchinot every day in my journal. And it was something that gave me a lot of comfort and consolation. And when the war started, I stopped for a bit, but then I picked it up very intensely, and it was just something that I kept doing. And Anne and Rachel and I, which we'll talk a little bit more later, but we've been in a writing group, the 3 of us, for the last 5 years. We meet every week, and they've been along the journey with me of my writing tchinot, personally, and my novel, and lots of different modalities. And it just was the right people at the right time to respond to a need, a really current modern need of what do we do when we don't have language to describe our experiences of the moment? It's such a tough situation that we're in, because how many of us during this war have said, "Ein milim"? I have no words. I don't know what to say. Ein milim to my friend, to my spouse, to my kids. I don't know how to explain this to my kids. Ein milim in my tefillot. Too often. Personally, I know too often I've gotten to that place. But the thing is that on that day, I just had this like overwhelming sense that there were women, leaders, mentors, teachers, Torah academics, poets, artists, masters of creative expression, as Anne likes to say, who did and who would have the language in this format, because how else do we respond but tefillah? And the nature of it is so complex. And ultimately, I was thinking about Miriam Hanaviyah. And on the 7th day of Pesach, we know that's when Bnei Israel left Mitzrayim. Now, there's a lot of interesting Midrashim and Chazal talk a lot about that particular experience. One of the things that they say is that the women of the generation of Yetziat Mitzrayim were the ones who were zocha to be taken, that the whole Bnei Israel were zocha because of them. Because what did they do? They took instruments out of Mitzrayim with them. So you imagine they had like a donkey and like a kid on their hip and like the matzahs on their back, and then like a drum or like some sort of tupim that they were bringing with them. And in that faith that they knew that they needed those instruments because there would be a moment of redemption, that we were granted redemption at all. And we also know that Miriam was the one who started the Shirah. She was the one who started to sing, and the women joined and the whole nation joined. And that, as Rachel likes to call it, like that moment of calling it the miracle. Like there's the moment of trauma of going through the sea and being chased and the bewilderment, but then being stopped to pause and saying, hey, wait a second, there's something that we have to do now. We have to respond in a really important way. And so Shirah is a really evocative and powerful and useful tool. And I wondered to myself, after experiencing all the miracles that we had been experiencing and the pain, so much pain, why couldn't the next redemption be brought by us? Because we know that the ultimate redemption is meant to mirror the redemption from Yetziat Mitzrayim. So if the women brought the first one, we'll bring the second. And the question is, well, why couldn't that be us? And if it is us, what do we need to do to prepare? And that's how Nashir was born. And so we partnered with the three of us immediately the next day, said, yes, 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 let's do this. And then we partnered with 70 women, writers, artists, and translators, editors. Gosh, so many things to put this book together. We thought it would be a teeny tiny slim little volume, and it's a monstrosity. It's 560 pages and 120 or 115 tefillot and 30 pieces of artwork, and
Hebrew and English.
Hebrew and in English, yeah. Each piece is in Hebrew and English, and that's how it was born. Oh yeah, now it's my turn to ask you a question. So Rachel, this is a question for Rachel.
We've made it easy on all of you.
Yes, we have. So we've had a lot of conversation amongst the three of us. I mean, endless conversation amongst the three of us. Very entertaining, I must add. And I know that for many of the conversations, there was an element of surprise for all of us in different aspects. And you expressed a lot of surprise and discoveries. And I'm curious if you can elaborate on how your expectations were different than the reality that this became.
Beyond what you already mentioned, the difference between a 40-page volume and a 500-page volume.
Yes.
There's several surprises, and we'll talk later about the translation and the whole bilingual aspect, so I'll reserve my surprises of that aspect for later, and there were numerous. But I'll say this, that going in, I thought we all knew what we were talking about when we were talking about prayer. Like we said prayers, we're putting together a book of prayers, and in my mind, the hard thing to explain to the women we turned to write the prayers was to explain to them that it's okay if it's informal and if it's okay if it doesn't rhyme. And I thought that was going to be the conversation. And in fact, I found myself engaged in many conversations about, but what is prayer? And some of these conversations were upfront, the women said, but does this count? Does this count? Some of it was a little bit, I wouldn't say antagonistic, but more complicated, because they would submit something and I would instinctively say, but this is not prayer. And that required me to take a step back and see why it's not prayer. And then in the conversations between us, I discovered that we don't agree. And I'll ask Anne about that in a second, but we don't agree about what is prayer. There's a famous midrash that there's 10 lashonot tefillah. I can tell you that in this book that has 55 writers in it, there's at least 55 lashonot tefillah. And I think that some of us have dual, if not triple, lashonot tefillah inside us as it is. But through all these conversations and all this work, one thing kept coming back over and over again as a recurring thread almost, or something that threads through all of it, which is a tefillah, no matter if it's angry or sad or hopeful or grateful, tefillah involves an act of acknowledging where we are and then also saying, but that is where we want to be. In other words, tefillah is in its very nature. It's not just, we have the pasuk, the beautiful pasuk, we sing it in Hallel. Mina metzar karati ya anani b'rochavei. I called from the narrow straits, and he answered me in the open spaces. So I'm saying it's not just that we hope God will answer us by opening up our world from all the things that we feel like they're crushing us. We're about to mark the anniversary of a siege, right? And in Hebrew, the word sar and the word matzor are obvious. I mean, matzor comes from the word sar, and it's this feeling of siege, of it's narrow, I can't breathe, everything is closing on me. But I realized that the act of tefillah is already liberating us to some extent, regardless of God's answer. We hope that God's answer will expand our world, open up possibilities, as Miriam's beautiful prayer says, let him show his face and release the hostages. But the very act of prayer means that we start that process for ourselves. The very fact we pray, karatiya, means we're already a little bit in the merchavya, because praying requires asking for something, right? Lefalel in Hebrew is to hope. And indeed, I realize that prayer is by essence an act of hope, because it implies, it demands of us not to stay where we are, but rather to envision the possibility of something else. Now, it doesn't mean that we know how to get from point A to point B. If we did, maybe we wouldn't pray about it. We would just go on and do it, right? But we can at least feel that there's something else we want. And I think that inspires and strengthens and becomes a call for action. So I don't think I realized that going in. I don't think I realized that prayer is by nature something that pulls you up of your own straits. So that was my surprise, or my process. And I wanted to turn to you, Anne, and say that I know you came from a different and specific tradition of prayer, Mesorah of prayer, through your learning and the kind of learning you both learned and taught over the years. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about what this tradition is and how the process of working on the book challenged you or invited you to expand beyond that, or not.
So I've taught tefillah. I've taught both the liturgy and also like the philosophy and thinking about how to pray. And I kind of took it as a given. And I'm sure I got this from, I don't even know, from Rav Soloveitchik, from the Torah Ora books, meaning I had a broad background of, all the different people who come to talk about prayer, that anything you can ask for, you're believing that you could be answered in the affirmative, or you would not be asking. So in that sense, this reaching that Raphael describes is exactly what I think we all think prayer has to be. But I think I also came to it with a much more formal sense, the sense of the Siddur, the sense that within the words of the Siddur, people say it's the greatest work of philosophy, right? You could find anything you want within the Siddur. So what do we need to write our own tefillot? And I didn't ever formulate the question in that obnoxious kind of way, but it was a bit of a resistance, at least at the beginning, to think, what are we really going to be doing? So, and you'll see, if you look at my tefillot in the book, they're taking classic tefillot that we say, Mizmor LeTodah on the one hand, with all due respect to David HaMelech, and the Yehi Ratzon before Hadlakat Nirot, and I've interpolated the modernity into the classic tefillot, because to me, my feeling was, okay, so stand with those words, the words that are already formalized and have been so for generations, and put all your intention into those words. The problem with that approach, I think it largely works for me. I think it works for many, many people. And I think there are many, many people who are left by the wayside. And that's no good. Tefillah has to be something that we can all access, because what tefillah also means, that Raphael hasn't yet mentioned really, is the connection that we forge with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with God, as we pray. And if you don't connect to the words of the Siddur, if you don't connect to that formality, if you can't find yourself within the words of the formality, then unfortunately you're going to be lost. And that's a travesty. And it's especially a travesty after a year, 15 months that we've now had, because it's a time that prayer is essential. We need to pray because we don't have so much else that we could be doing. I mean, if you do, go do that. But for most people, like that loss, that feeling of, what do I do? Let me at least turn to God. Let me at least forge that connection and in the hope that He will bring that redemption that Shira discusses. So, and the other angle of this is that my approach didn't have any room for external sharing of the creativity that goes into the process of prayer. I think everybody, when they come to pray, they bring themselves to it. And in doing that, that is creative by definition. You're bringing yourself to connect to God. But nobody else gets to share with you what you're doing, and you don't get to share with them what you're, meaning nobody's sharing the experience in a way that can actually help other people. So what resonated immediately with me from Shira's divine download was this idea that we could all be helping each other, that there's something out there that if people come together to express their reactions and responses and approaches to God from the now, then we're providing people with words that they may not have to say, but now they could. Now they'll have something to, everybody should write their own tefillot if they feel that they want to, right? Nobody says that tefillah has to be stamped in the siddur and otherwise you can't, you can't. And even if somebody says that, it's also just not true. We all know that we go through our days praying wordless prayers, personal prayers, constantly, right? Somebody's sick, you're saying all of Tehillim, and in your head, you're saying your own words, right? So to me, this became that endeavor, the endeavor with all the people who joined us in the effort that we didn't expect in the beginning, to articulate where they're coming from, where they're going, how they're going to connect to God through and about the experiences of the now. And I think that was an experience that then enabled me to see the Siddur differently as well. I think the Siddur kind of, now I think, the Siddur pushes us to bring ourselves to the Tefillah, and these prayers do as well. People wrote from the heart, because that's what it is, right? Avodah Shebalev. They wrote from the heart, they shared of themselves, and they worded it so that other people could come and participate and take from that for their own need to pray, to connect, and to address, I guess, the reality that we're living in. Oh, it's my turn now?
Can I just add something while you're
Please.
getting that? I think we talked about surprises, kind of in line with what Anna's saying. I mean, I didn't realize how sharing the bridges we form with God individually creates a bridge between us, and how much strength we can draw from that.
That's a fallacy of no minion, but okay. Shh, I didn't say that. Okay, Shira, as you've already begun to address, your sense of Jewish history is strong, and this path to Geula, I know, is also strong. And October 7th kind of threw you for a loop. Is that a fair, meaning, listen, I don't, the tragedy and shock and horror of October 7th, meaning obviously, but I'm talking here and asking you about the thread of Jewish history that this seems to have interrupted, that these events broke, so to speak, or maybe they didn't, and that's what I'm going to ask you. How do you, what happened there, and how are you resolving it now in the aftermath?
This is the toughest question of the night. I think for a lot of us, especially those of us who were raised with a certain narrative, a lot of us in the Dati Leumi world, in the modern Orthodox world, that were raised with a very specific narrative that, you know, we have reached a certain crescendo of history. You know, like my family are Holocaust survivors, we experienced the Shoah. The Shoah was supposed to be the end of the darkness, the great darkness. And then, you know, we started seeing the Arba Kanfot Haaretz, like we were the ingathering of the exiles began. And, you know, for those of us, especially who are Olim, we're very, very idealistic. We have to be in order to make the trip. And so the process of getting on that plane and putting all your stuff on that, you know, shipping container and saying to yourself, the future is here. There's only one course that could be for the future, and we're moving towards a messianic timeline. And the reason why we're making all these decisions is because we believe that we're moving forward in the messianic timeline. The only way we can go is up. I think a lot of people in our community felt that way for a long time. And yes, we've had terrorism, and it's the pain and the suffering of you know, the birth pangs of the Mashiach. You know, we thought that we knew what that was. And then October 7th happened. And I remember there were a lot of conversations immediately afterwards, just of the shock of the people who were talking about this and saying, where are we? Like, we thought that we were so much closer than it seemed. And I don't really have an answer to that, in the sense of we don't know where we are. What I can say is that I believe that we need to keep asking that question, and we have to keep traveling down that line. We have to keep following the timeline and keep living according to our value system. And I think what a lot of these tefillot, tchinot, and piyutim do is they ask the question of, like Ayeka, like, where are you? Where are we? And you know, my background is I'm a clinical social worker, and so my bias was always to make sure that these tefillah were infused with like real feelings, like anger and hope and grief and relief. And there were so many things that we tackled over the year, whether we were in response to the experience of hostages like Miriam wrote, or our own private sorot, or national pains or suffering, or miracles that we saw, big and small, and the hope that we had for the future. And so from my perspective, I feel like as Nashir does a really beautiful job of just holding space for this question, and the fact that we're asking it at all is the best that we can do. The fact that we're continuing to live in the traditions and we're continuing the path, we're marching down that timeline. That's the best that we can do, because ultimately we never know. We hope. We never know. We read Tanakh here in Israel, and it feels like it's talking to us. It feels like it's speaking the language of the present, and that is an awesome, extraordinary privilege. And so, yes, we still at this point, we're acknowledging the difference between the generation that we're living in now and every single generation that ever came before us. And the difference is that we have the ability to live here, to build here, to grow. And so I just want to, in response to that, I just want to read a tefillah that I wrote, a prayer for Mashiach, and may it be a prayer that's answered b'mheira b'yameinu. But I also think that it describes this contradiction and this this unique yearning that we're trying to capture here. In the early weeks of the darkest month, when the moon was blocked by fear and our blood was still soaking into the ground, there were whispers that your face was hidden. It can't be, we cried, believing we were already living in a time of miracles, already on the cusp of the end of days, and our hands were ready to pick up bricks and shape your vessels from gold, and for a new house that we would build together, convinced that we knew where we were heading and the only direction left to go was up. But when the plague of darkness was renewed and our path was blocked, and we were left questioning before the blood on our doorposts, will you come among us to smite our enemies with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm? As we fight to clear the darkness, sweat drenched and shoulder strained from all we carry, heavy with grief, grave diggers' dirt under our fingernails, we're searching for you. In every bullet hole, in every orphan's whimper, in every widow's sigh, every echo in the tunnels deep underground, every charred home, and in every racing pulse, are you here, we cry, and we find you in the missiles that miss their targets, in the iron dome fracturing the night sky, the hardiness of our soldiers' hearts, and in the love of those who send them off to war with faith that you will bring them home again. We find you in the words of strength from grieving mothers, in the hordes of your people who have rushed to be here in your name, in the hugs of reunited hostages and their families under the chupot of couples dressed in green. Avinu Shabashamayim, keep dispelling the darkness so that we can see you clearly. Dispel the clouds and let the sun rise to its zenith, bold and bright enough, so that the whole world can see you are with us, because we know where we are, standing on ancient soil, promised to our forefathers, pined for by generations, reborn out of the ashes of your nation. But are we ending the longest exile? We want to know when we are. Are we on the cusp of redemption? Are these the birth pangs you promised? Are we almost there? Sometimes it feels we're cycling backwards in infighting in politics, the risks and rewards of our own sovereignty, a nation alone among the rest of the nations. So please, show us your secret messianic vision. We're ready with our timbrels by the door, eager to rush into the streets of your holy cities. Songs of praise freed from our throats, feet flying with dance as we usher in a new era.
Amen. Amen.
So Rachel, you have been dealing with the fallout and the devastation of October 7th in several different capacities. In your personal life and in communal life, you have been doing a lot of grief work and also a lot of healing work. And how does your work here that you chose to do in Nashir tap into that, the grief and the healing?
So I want to take a step back and go back to those horrific first days, weeks after October 7th, when we were still identifying the dead and trying to understand who we are in this new world and what on earth happened to us. I mean, it was compounded by the fact that my kids were home and were scared, and I had to be with them, even though I wanted to be running around and helping people. But like, what I needed to do was sit home and hold my little kids on the couch because they were having panic attacks. And it didn't help that in the very, very first siren, when they ran downstairs to the miklat, I ran to help the neighbor and the bedridden neighbor. And they thought something happened to me. They didn't catch me telling them that I'll come after. And they kept worrying about me. They kept being scared for me, especially my little one, who was first grader at the time. And I very quickly realized that I can't do anything about the big picture. I'm not a soldier. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist. Like there's nothing I can do in terms of first aid. I can't go fight. I can't go heal, and I can't go do therapy, you know. And I was very grateful that there are many wonderful people who do that, and I use some of their services on the therapy front. But I felt like I have to do something to help, because if there's not something I can focus on that's in my hands, that's mine and in my control, and I can do, then I will lose my mind and I will give in to despair. And I realized that as a writer and as a teacher, a Torah teacher, I have a very obvious role, which is to uplift spirits, to kind of help the people around me in my immediate circle and students and readers to hold on to hope. And here I mean hope in a very serious sense. Rabbi Sachs makes this distinction in To Heal a Fractured World, I forgot, sorry, between optimism and hope. He says optimism is this belief that things will be okay in the end, and hope is the commitment to make it so. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he highlights the fact that optimism can be very passive and, as Anne likes saying, Pollyannish. And ultimately, it can fail you because then things don't get better and you don't know what to do with yourself. Whereas hope is a commitment. It's work that you have to do. So I started thinking, how can I help the people around me hold on to hope? And through that, hold on to hope myself. And a lot of the work was through delving into Torah or through conversation. Sadly, in the past few months, my community went through several very devastating losses. A beloved member of Avi Goldberg was killed, and brother of a member was killed, and a father of a member was killed, all within 3 weeks. And it was just, I mean, community members lost dear cousins, grandsons, nephews already before, but this came very, very close. And I continued that work. And yet something bothered me in all those different capacities, which is that at the end of the day, all I could offer people were my own words or my own methods for making sense of reality or my own understanding of Torah, which I'm very grateful that they have the opportunity to share it and that people find it inspiring and helpful. But at the end of the day, when, you know, if I give Anne my insights, but they're my insights, through my own internal makeup, kind of that's what appeals to me. If I give them to Anne, they're not necessarily useful for Anne. Or if I share my Torah with Shira, as is, it's not necessarily what she needs to hear right now. And what I really wanted to do was to do the work that Aharon and the Kohanim are doing as the Rashar Hirsch understands the Behalotcha Tanerot, like what it means to light the menorah, where he says that it's really to model education. And education, par excellence, according to Rabbi Rashar Hirsch, is not giving your ideas and your words to people, but bringing them enough light, enough fire until they light up for themselves, until they discover their own inner light and rise up. And I was trying to do that at all kinds of capacities, but it's hard work to do. And then when Shira came up to us with the idea of as Nashir, I didn't realize it once, but that was like an answer to my internal prayer of finding a way to do that. Because yes, we wrote a lot of words and asked wonderful women like Miriam to write words for us. But at the end of the day, what it did, and we've seen that it really does that, is it inspired so many readers to then find their own words. It empowered them just by giving them so many words they could relate to in different styles and from different angles to find their angle and their style and their voice. And I feel like that got closest to lighting up the menorah in that regard, and really not uplifting someone, but inspiring someone to uplift themselves, which is, I think, the greatest. When someone told me, a friend of mine who told me that, I couldn't pray at all until I read it, and now I wrote my own prayer, that was like, for me, okay, for this, we did it. For me, this is it. This was what I wanted to do. And I want to turn to you, Anne, and say that we talk a lot about the language of grief and healing and needs. I mean, this is called women's prayers for our time of need. I wanted to ask you if you could give us a little bit of a bird's view, a little bit of an overview, not of this particular theme or that particular prayer, but rather of what are the kind of answers, the kind of themes, the kind of needs that emerge when you look at it in its totality in the book.
Okay, so a few things about this book, besides its glorious cover, right? As Nashir, we have the inspiration, right, from Miriam, Haniviyah, the Song of the Sea, After the Sea, but also, of course, our subtitle, We Will Sing Again, is playing off of We Will Dance Again, right, from the rave, from the Supernova Festival. We opened our networks and petitioned people to write for us, and many people said no. And some of those people we convinced to write anyway. And some people came and said, I've been writing all year here. I've got several things for you. And we took them, for the most part, just about everything. And we were a little hesitant at the beginning. Are these going to be overlapping in too much of a way, right? Is everybody going to write about the hostages? Is everybody going to write about the soldiers, right? There are so many topics that are on everybody's mind. Is everybody going to write about those same things? And we discovered that they did not at all. We have, each section of the book has its own header page, whatever the technicalities are. Prayers for prayer, because so many people felt that they had no words and they didn't know how to turn to God. Prayers for daily life, because daily life had become something totally different. Prayers for the land, the people, and the state. I don't think that needs explanation. Realities of war. And the realities of war prayers included prayers for family members who were off to war, people who, were talking about the wounded, again, hostages, right? Being delivered from the missiles, right? Those Iranian attacks, which at the time of the publication of As Nashir had just happened only once, but then it happened again.
Sequel. Twice more.
Home front, parenting in war, which doesn't apply to everybody, but in some ways it applies to everybody, because even if you don't have your own children, everybody's relating to everybody in that same need of needing care. And so it doesn't have to be a biological child and parent for there to be parenting in war. And the tefillot reflect that kind of looking out for each other, no matter what the relationship. Mourning, true mourning. Adina Saslovich has 2 tefillot in here. We have a widow's prayer, somebody who lost her husband, somebody who lost her son. women's life cycle, because we felt, how could we have a book of tefillot about women, by women, for women, also men, but for women, without mentioning the Hadlakat Nerot, Hafrashat Chala, and Tarat HaMishpacha. So those are in there because we're following the tradition of the Tchinot that did exactly this. And likewise, women's mitzvot, Shabbat, whispered words. How many times do you not even know how to say what you want to say, so you whisper them and you come with all of your emotions? And then dialogue with the divine, because isn't that what it's all about? Except for, again, so much difficulty finding those words to dialogue with the divine, especially when you don't feel the answer, a response from the divine. A new year, because at the time that we published, we kind of both, it was Likrat, the October 7th anniversary, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and we kind of hoped that it would be just over by then. And then lastly, of course, redemption, because redemption is where we end. Whether that's a long journey or a short journey, there's that recognition. And I think, Raphael, you've certainly mentioned in the past, you mentioned a bit now, this idea that we found that no matter what tefillah people submitted on all of these topics, all of the tefillot, I think bar none, but you could correct me, end with hope. Because that is the nature of prayer, because that goes back to this idea that you're reaching for something, that you're stating something can change. We need something in our tefillot, even when it's thank you, and even when it's praise of God. There's a recognition that who we are needs to be in a different place than we are right now. If all we want is a deepening of the relationship with God, that's also a request in a way, underlying it, and also a statement of hope that we can get there. I think that was the most powerful takeaway for me from all of the submissions that we had, that it's not like anybody consulted. It's not like we said, we want this to end. Finish your prayer with a note of hope. Not at all, but they all do. And some are more cheery, and some, one or two, are just pure faith. And that several of them are angry, rage, confusion, lacking clarity over how to go about anything anymore. And they all end on that note of hope. And I find that to be the overarching of the book as a whole, as Nashir, right? It's a statement to the future. Okay, Rachel, in your hat as a resident native Hebrew speaker, in case you weren't sure. This book is entirely, and if you aren't sure, it's entirely in Hebrew and English. It's not quite as good as in the Siddur, right? The line by line. Oh, stop. It's not quite as line by line as in the Siddur, but very close. We worked really hard to line everything up so that at least it's on the same page and that the translation should match. And we went back to the authors, whatever language they wrote in. Did you write in Hebrew? Did you write in English? Now we've translated. Did we line up our translation with your intent? It was a lot of effort, a lot of effort. And because you are our native Hebrew speaker, a lot of that fell to you. So perhaps you could weigh in on exactly what it meant to be approaching this with the two languages, right? And how is this essential to the...
I feel like I should answer this in Hebrew accent.
Sounds funny.
I could give you a very long answer that will keep you all here all night and rant a little bit about some aspects of work with Hebrew and English, but instead I'll tell you a story. And I think that story really opens up the whole thing. Tehillah Friedman, the former MK, wrote a beautiful, beautiful prayer in Hebrew. It's an angry prayer. It's a prayer that asks God, where are you? And I'm using nicer words than she does. And it worked. In Hebrew, it worked. Because in Hebrew, I find people write more tersely. You know, partly it's a matter of the way the language is, because we work with roots, and you can, you know, I mean, one of the things we discovered is that you can say in half a page in Hebrew what you say in a full page in English, which I'll leave you to imagine how hard it is to align those. Because of that, there was a moment when we talked about playing with the size of the font. It was so difficult.
We talked about Nikud. We
Yeah.
talked about a lot of crazy things.
But it's also that in Hebrew, when you read Hebrew Facebook posts, for example, you will find that a lot of times they're kind of terse and harsh, but it's okay. It doesn't land as angry. It lands as intense, earnest, heroic sometimes, kind of like we're saying the truth as it is. But then when we translated her prayer as is, with all these fragments of sentences without verbs, allusions that are contained in 2 words and then in a kuda and moving to the next thing, and what came off in English, when you read it from an English point of view, was, oh my God, this person is converting to Christianity, or becoming a monk in Tibet. Like, it was the anger that is truly there became amplified through the way it landed in English. And there was a lot of back and forth, and Shira and her clinical editor was like, no, we can't do that. Why we can't do that? And I went back to Tehila, and was a very busy person, so we had interesting WhatsApp messages at 2 a.m., all kinds of interesting experiences. The end result was that I changed the prayer in English. In prayer in English, some of those broken sentences become full sentences. Some of the allusions are made explicit, so that the anger, which is her true emotion, and I think deserves being put out there, and we should relate to it, and doesn't land as rejection of God, but rather as still in conversation. And I think a lot of my work ended up being in that space of not just making sure that the translation is correct and the word in Hebrew and the word in English line up, but rather making sure
Did that.
also that. But there was a lot of what's the emotional cadence and rhythm that happens here, and that was really important for us to make sure it lands correctly, so that the spirit of the prayer comes across correctly, more than that the language. And
I want to follow up.
yeah,
Because it was your initiative, I think, that we made sure that this was both Hebrew and English, and included native Hebrew speakers whose English is frankly not necessarily good. Also people who are bilingual, but right. And I want to give you the opportunity to explain why that was.
I can say my reasons. I wonder if your reasons are the same. It started very much in the Anglo community, because Shira and Anne, and professionally
Resident
myself as well. And professionally, I'm in the English space a lot. And but I said, if we're publishing a book in Israel of Israeli women who pray and how they respond, and we exclude, let's admit it, most of the population, then we're doing something wrong. We're not representative. We're not being representative. And I thought it's really important to push the envelope and really expand and reach out. And there's still, I think, more women who wrote in English than originally and than Hebrew, but I'm very grateful to all the Hebrew speaking authors who, not knowing who we are because they're not part of the Anglo world and are not familiar with the work, still put their faith in us and agreed to let us.
And I have heard, like, really, by the by, Israelis who do not speak English, who do not know English, who do not know me, have, the best example is my son's Memale Makom for a maternity leave, went to high school with Rachel.
Your son's teacher.
What did I say?
Memale Makom. Gabriel is not going to.
Correct. Sorry, see, not a native Hebrew speaker. The teacher went on maternity leave. There's Machlifa, and she went, lo and behold, I discovered she went to high school with Rachel. But the way I discovered is because she said to my son, is your mother, because she knew my name, it's here, right in Hebrew also,
I know.
is your mother the one who worked with Rachel on that book? That's so wonderful. And I was like, in fact, yeah. And he said, like, he was so proud. It was very cute. He's 10. So the circles expanded much more dramatically, I think, than they would have had it only been in English for the English speaking world.
And since it's really a book about bridges to a great extent, right? The bridge between us and God, between us and ourselves when we're blocked off, between us and each other, creating a community of women, which is what I'm going to ask Shira about right now. I thought it was fitting also to create a bridge between the primarily Hebrew speaking and primarily English speaking communities of women in Israel. Men can be included also. As a friend of mine said, God can edit the gendered terms on his end. So. And speaking of bridges, I want to turn to you, Shira, for your final question of the night. You could have written this book on your own. You could have written a book of prayers on your own. but I know that it was important to you. It was important to your vision to push it, not just to include the two of us as full partners, but also to include many, many contributors and to include many women and make it really a collaborative effort. And I wanted to ask you about that. Why was that such a big part of your vision? And what did you envision? What did you see when you thought about it going in?
I love that question because I could talk about this all day and I will not. But one of my favorite parts of being a woman is the particular archetype of female leadership, which is collaborative leadership. If I had done this by myself, it might have been that small, thin, appropriate, I'm sure, insightful volume, but having the opportunity to work with two of my closest friends was like the coolest. I'm gonna like not be coy about it. It was like the coolest thing ever. I got to work and write alongside my friends, my colleagues, my teachers, my mentors, people that I look up to, spiritual leaders, people whose writing I admire and love, and each one was like another jewel that fell into place in this process. And I think that something that we struggle with as Orthodox women is our struggle with community. In the sense that we're raised in a community. When we get to be 19 years old, 20 years old, we're in midrasha and we're in this and we're seminary, depends where you come from. And we have these really, really strong communities when we're in college, and then we get married. We leave the house, or we grow up and we leave the house, and then we turn to the real world of adulthood, and those communities are not the same. They're not the same. We all have a lot of responsibilities in the home, and our responsibilities to the home primarily, and not to our own need for community in the same way that men have the opportunity to go to shul 3 times a day and see their buddies and to commune with them and to connect with them or to pray with them. And so something that I've thought about a lot over the last couple of years, like especially with like my first book, Layers, one of the comments that I really loved about it was that, you know, it was interviews of Jewish women here in Israel, and people felt like they were making friendships in absentia, where you're reading about a woman and you're feeling that kinship, you're feeling that connection, you're feeling like she gets you, that like you could probably sit down and you tell her your life story, like she's telling you hers, and she would get it. This book has the same ta'am. It feels the same way. When you open it up and you read a tefillah, and I told the writer specifically, I said, and close your eyes and imagine that the woman who's going to be reciting it, because it's not reading, you're not reading these, you're reciting them. It's not a book to read, it's a book to recite, that the woman is sitting next to you, and hold her hand. And what is it that you have to share? What is it that she needs you to say, or that she needs you to convey or open for her? And I think it can be a really important creative exercise for all of us, especially during the war, where my friend Zipporah Lifshitz likes to say, we were cities of women. The men had left, had gone to war, and all was left was us. And what did we do? You know, as Anne said, our expansion of motherhood really, really, really stretched. It wasn't just about our own children anymore. It was about our neighbors, our friends, their children, you know, their parents. Like, who could we care for? But then who was caring for us in these cities of women? Sometimes no one, and most of the time each other. And I like to say that creating As Nashir was a really beautiful way to spend a very painful summer, a summer of grief, a lot of death, a lot of suffering and confusion and fear. And the way that I spent it on a personal level was I was every single day, day in, day out, talking to these people who I respect and love so tremendously, and just learning from them, listening to their wisdom, spending time with their life experiences. You know, every time I sat with a new writer and we began to workshop a piece, the first thing I asked them was, when has this year been like for you? Where we begin? What do you need to say? And so in this process, relationships for me, they deepened. They were so rich. The vulnerability that's offered here is so rich, so validating. And I think for every reader who could pick this up, man, woman, child, you pick this up, and women really bare their souls here. And their faith and the incredible resiliency that Jewish women have the capacity to hold space for. So it was a pleasure and a privilege to work in a collaborative fashion. If I had just sat, and this notebook here is filled with prayers. I wrote them yesterday, I wrote them last week. They're just my personal little notes, what I write down, publish them. Been nice. You may have bought it, I don't know, but would it have meant the same thing? No, because when you pick this up, you're picking up a community. So no matter where you are, if you're sitting in the hospital, or you're sitting at a shiva, or you're sitting in your own home and it's Shabbos and you're scared, and whatever it is, you pick this up and all of these women are just, they're there. They're alive here in this, their hopes, their dreams, their faith. And that was extraordinary. And I'm so glad. Thank you for doing this with me. It's been a true privilege, a highlight of my life to work with my friends and people that I love, and it's a privilege to be here to talk about it. And as we finish, we have some tefillot that we want to read, but first Anne's just going to give us a couple minutes of the Torah that she's extrapolated from this.
So one of the questions that we keep being asked, and we'll open for questions at some point in the evening too, if you have them, and then we'll close pretty soon. But one of the questions is, what do we hope for this book in the long run, right? All of that effort. And we kind of hoped that the war would be over and the hostages would be home before we ever went to press. And if we had to scrap it all, it would have been okay.
Oh yeah.
But since we didn't, now it's here, and it's the Library of it's going to be, right? All the books that they go to Library of Congress, they go to the National Library because it's been published. What do we hope for this? And it's hard to have a hope for it, but I can tell you that what I started noticing after I made sure that all the commas were in the right places and that we spelled God the same way each time, and all the other editing, proofreading types of things that we needed to make sure were clear. At some point, I stepped back and started paying attention again to the meaning of the words. And I will say that from the beginning, I think there were tefillot that really spoke to me, and tefillot that I was like, okay, that's lovely, that's not for me. Somebody else will find meaning in that. And maybe that person won't find meaning in the one that I first found meaning in. And that's okay, because we're a diverse crew, right? We're a diverse Jewish people, and we're a diverse set of women, and there's that diversity represented here. And then over time, as I started paying attention to the content again, I found that the same tefillot that I felt were, not really for me, now spoke to me, because either I was a different person or because some of the words hit in a particular way. And I realized that there are, besides hope, there are themes running throughout that I pay attention to now in a different way, because now granted, we have a familiarity with the words at a level that we don't really wish on anybody else. But the themes are there. And I feel like, Rachel, you said this once, that it's a book that is ripe for the studying of it. And I'm not gonna give a whole shir on Nashir right now, because we don't have time. But we could. I'll give you my best example. One time when I went to speak about Nashir, and I chose a few to read, 4 tefillot to read, and I realized that several of the 4 used the word hands, hands. And I happen to have, the PDF of the book, so I could search very easily to find out how many times is it actually in the book. And the answer is 79, but that includes handle, and it includes handsome. So, okay, whatever. So knock it down to 60, let's say. Somebody said handsome. And it includes the introduction, it includes the biographies, whatever, but for the most, let's say it's 60, even if it's 50. The word hand comes up, hands, in many, many tefillot. Once, twice, 3 times. Rachel, you have one that's like 6 times in there. Oh. And sometimes those hands are God's hands. In the tefillah that Miriam read, right, there's the God's outstretched hand, arm, right? The words that we know from the liturgy include this image. It's not a surprise that it should be there when we're talking about a search for God saving us, you also have it in your tefillah, right? Meaning it's there. Sometimes those hands are our hands. Sometimes they're, Romy Sussman has a tefillah about how she went to help the soldiers and she was serving them food in a station, right, where they were on break. And she's talking about handing them, right? But she's using the word hands. You could say feed, right? Like there's a lot of different words that could have replaced the choices that people made. Again, nobody made them in conjunction. I came to this after the fact and by happenstance until I went to look. And sometimes the hands are representing the relationship between two people, hand in hand, as an expression comes up a couple of times. And it made me start to think, and this would be the shear that I would give if I were giving a whole shear, right? We would go through the tefillot and say, what does it all mean in this context, in that context? God's hands, our hands, the tefillot of Birkat Kohanim. There's hands in there, and they're mentioned in the book. Why are we talking about hands in so many different tefillot in different ways that all still kind of come back around together? And it strikes me that those connections between people and between humanity and God are very much represented in the strength of our hands. Because that's how we come to do things. And there's one of the tefillot talks about the working of our hands, and one of the tefillot talks about the helping of our hands and the support that we give to each other, again, hand in hand. I think that it speaks to, Shira, what you're speaking about, motherhood, right? This idea that we are there to care for each other. And that as a theme that emerges from a book of tefillot, from this time of need, we're very much bereft. Our hands are empty, our hands are full. We're working with them, we're seeking companionship. One person uses them to talk about the hands of the enemy and how we were delivered from them, right? It's really there. There are other words you can search, and also you can find the same kind of repetition of a term's use, right? We do this in Tanakh, lahavdil. We do it in Tanakh. There's truth to it here as well, I think, because we're all coming, all the writers here come from this heritage of prayer, heritage of Jewish texts. So we're drawing upon what we ourselves want to convey. And I think that the hands come to mean love. Not to be too corny about it, but I think that that's the depth of the relationship, that at some level it goes beyond care to a depth of love, because we're talking about God's hands. We're in God's hands. We reach to God with our hands. We reach for each other. We walk hand in hand. We take care of each other. We yearn for God's outstretched, strong arm and outstretched hand. I've said it backwards. The hope that we have for this book is that people recite the tefillot when they need to, when they want to. It's not a beach book. You can't go through it. Shira did it once. You can't go through it at one sitting. But it's there for the taking in your hands. And I would say we hope that the future, whatever some scholar down the road is going to find it dusty in a university library, will see just how rich our experiences in putting them into words come to the fore in a way that they can be studied and that they can be learned from, and that they can then, I hope, be applied, because we're talking about application. They could be an academic down the road. I want to note just also one other thing, and it's another representation of the hands, per se. Oh, look, Raphael, look what I came to. Shira mentioned 30 artworks. There are paintings from fine artists. This one's by Raphael's mom, Avital Sharansky, throughout. And I do not think this book would be the same were it not for them. They also form their own approach to prayer, right? Not everybody uses words. You may have seen this painting elsewhere. It's been around. Yael Harris Resnick. You can see in the background, there's Holocaust survivors and the Chayalot coming forward. So for us, this became that labor of love. And I think that that's where we want it to go. That we think that the words within have where to go. That there's truth and creativity and hope and resonance, I hope, in this book and for our community. I will say also that it becomes harder to sustain, right? The book becomes, useful and needed in a different way than it was when Shira first talked to us about it, because we've become acclimated to tragedy, and that is not good. So we hope that the hope of the book, will serve you if you choose to engage in it, and even if not, right, that the idea here of coming to tefillah in a new way, it is, we say it's in God's hands, it's also in yours. Adina.
We're very lucky that tonight we had a couple of our writers join us. Choose the one that you wish. This is our amazing Adina. You guys know her. She needs no introduction here in this neighborhood, but she did us an incredible toiva to include her tefillot, because I think that people think that everything is a reaction to the war, but we have real life. We experience real grief outside of the war, alongside the war. We have our personal lives alongside the war, and Adina has done a really powerful job of capturing that and bringing it to this moment.
Okay, this is called Yisker for my son. For my son Rachi Yitzchak ben Abraham and Adina Sarah. Remember the one I have not forgotten and never will forget. Remember his smile, his pure soul, his absence that is a scar on my heart. In his merit, I will give tzedakah to help those in need, as he did in his lifetime. In his merit, I will learn Torah, as he did before he died. In his merit, does he need our actions? Our actions that will never make up for all the chesed he never got a chance to do, all the Torah he did not yet learn, the family that he never grew. Hashem, his soul is with you for safekeeping. We pray for you to remember. We will never forget. These acts that we are doing in his merit today are a merit for us, an opportunity to feel connected and to continue his goodness in this world.
Amen.
We also tonight have the privilege to have the extraordinary Ariella Zeitlin with us. Ariella, will you read your tefillah for us? Find it for you.
In there somewhere.
I know it's 3. This book is so large.
You couldn't include a violin presentation in the book.
Somebody's
'Cause
on a
that's your-
playlist.
What?
Somebody here is a favorite.
Oh, okay. No, but I was just thinking that
Offered.
because you were talking about,
Yeah.
expression, the art is it, because your playing is tefillah too.
Absolutely,
Do another
100%.
event.
Well, Ariella came to our launch and she performed at our launch. It was extraordinary.
So my biggest struggle in my life has been that I'm scared. I'm scared to do things that I haven't done before. I'm scared to experience things. I'm scared to really allow myself to love like my family. I grew up in a very complicated family situation, and like learning to like handle my fear and deal with my fear as opposed to numbing myself with all the things that are available in our lives to numb ourselves with has been a huge struggle for me. And it's a big part of my journey that I grew up in Baltimore. Sorry, I'm just gonna like talk. I grew up in Baltimore, and I had access to very serious drugs from a very young age. And by the time I was 16, I was pretty much like getting high several times a week. And that lasted until I was 22. And I met my husband, and he really helped me to get clean and to kind of recognize that there are bigger things in our lives than just looking for the short-term pleasure that will be a temporary Band-Aid. So I talk a lot about fear, and I talk a lot about fear in my performances, and I talk a lot about fear. And if you want to achieve anything in your life, you have to face your fear, and you have to face the hard feelings, and you have to deal with the fact that none of us have perfect lives, and none of us, like, there's really like, I don't know, a lot of us grew up in the United States where it's very normal to say, my life is perfect, and like, let's make everybody match and like make everybody look great. But like not talk about what's really going on. So that being said, my prayer is about fear. I'm gonna read it.
God, as I stand in the deep darkness of my soul, please allow one drop of light in. One drop that I will catch onto, swing from, hang onto, one moment that I will pull on, pull down, and cherish. One moment where we hold each other and do your work together. Give me access to your channel, your strength that gives me light in my step. From somewhere far above and beyond and around me, use me. Use me as a divine fragment and help me take that light and make it grow. Nourish the seed you planted in me. Fill me from inside and raise me, roots strong, leaves outstretched to your light. And as I grow, open my eyes and help me see your light shrink that darkness, folding around me, wisping into nothingness. Help me raise my face and find that I am safe, able to hold my fear, to keep it for when it will serve me, to motivate me, to push me to what I need. Going to sleep with, oh, is that other way?
That's the English Hebrew problem.
Oh, ground me so that I will not waver for what is fear when you are with me. Lo irara ki ata imadi. Abba, Father, you are my every breath. I will lack nothing because you carry me, and I will be a great warrior of Israel in my heart and in my soul and through your name. I will be a binder, a connector, the lion you planted in me, and in your name I will roar, and in your name I will live and love as your child. Hold me, Abba.
Amen. Amen. We have one final prayer. Rachel.
I want to share with you a prayer called a prayer for focus. And I do want to say 2 sentences about it. First, I want to say that this prayer is born out of a practice I learned from my father, Natan Sharansky. Years ago, when I was going through something that seemed difficult to me at the time, little did I know, and I expressed my frustration, he said, "Let me tell you what I did when I felt this way in prison." Immediately putting it in comic perspective and making it a little hard to whine. But then he went on to say something that I think applies outside of prison cells. Said that for him, the greatest challenge was that the KGB tries to play psychological games with you. It tries to kind of break you, to make you give in. And one of the tools at their disposal is making you desperate to feel agency, desperate to feel like you control your fate, because all your control is taken from you. You don't control where you are, who you're with, what you're wearing, what you eat, when you exercise. None of those things are in your control. So every little scrap of, privileges that they can offer you becomes very alluring. And he realized early on that he needs to develop some sort of psychological defense against it, not to let them get to him. So he said, I need to focus on the things that are in my hands. I can't focus on everything I want to have, all the freedoms I want to have, because if I do, it'll just tantalize me and I'll become easy to break. I need to focus on what's in my hands. So he said every day he would ask himself, what are my big goals and what's in my hands today, right now, to achieve them? Now, the big goal was not to break, not to stand up for what he believed in. And the things he could do were very little. Sometimes it was just not to engage in conversation with the jailer when they're trying to taunt him. Sometimes it was eating his food so that he's strong. Sometimes it was not eating his food when he was on a hunger strike. Sometimes it was exercising, even though he didn't feel like it, to keep himself as healthy as he could. It was very small things, but he had to focus on those things. And the more he focused on those things, and not just things that are in control, things that are in control but are in service of the big goal, the more power he had to withstand the pressures of the KGB. So I took that and it became my practice. Whenever I started feeling lost or frustrated, I would ask myself, what are my big goals and what can I do today to achieve them? And I feel like this practice I was very grateful for having developed it when the war started. And I mean, look, I wasn't in a prison cell in Siberia, but so many things that used to be in my control were no longer in my control because our whole life was upended. My brother-in-law was in Jenin and it was not in my control to help him. And it was not in my control to go and rescue the hostages, and it was not in my control to help the women. None of these things were in my control. And I tried to focus on what's in my control. And I wrote this prayer out of this yearning, out of this need to remind myself of this as a way to survive, as a way to thrive. I wrote it in Hebrew. I'll read it in the English. A prayer for focus. My God, on the days in which I am tempted to gaze round with weary eyes and allow my heart to fill with fear, help me to look at my loved ones and recall what is in my hands, here's the hands, to control, to encourage, to support, to embrace, to listen, to sow small seeds of encouragement in beating hearts. That's all. This is what is in my hands to do. Help me to plant what I am meant to plant and leave all that remains in your hands. Bezrat Hashem.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. We'll be selling. Oh, sure.
Thank you. I was also.
תפילה למיקוד. אלי, בימים שבהם אני מתפתה להביט מסביב בעיניים חוששות ומרשה לליבי לרבות פחד, עזור לי להביט על אהוביי ולזכור את שנתון בידיי, לעודד, לתמוך, לחבק, להקשיב, לזרוע זירי עידוד קטנים בלבבות. זהו, זה בידיי. עזור לי לזרוע את מה שעליי לזרוע ולהפקיד את כל השאר בידך.
Amen. We'll be selling the books in the back. They're 100 shekel, down from 125. You can find them in the store.
If you have questions, we're here first.
Oh, yeah. Well, I
We
guess
forgot,
that's
sorry.
9:40.
9:40.
Yeah.
One or
We
two
know it's late,
questions?
but if anybody has a pressing question, you can also contact us
I have
afterwards.
a quick one.
Yeah, sure.
So when the women who came up read and they shared a little bit of their story, sitting up there, it's very powerful to then hear the poem after the story. Is that something you guys weighed when you wrote this book, that allowed people to write a little
Blurb.
snippet of what it meant and why?
No, and I'll tell you why. Because what was the most important part of this for us, like, you know me, I love telling stories. I'm always going to let women tell their stories. That's something that I live for. That being said, the purpose of this was about universality. Is that if you came to this book, and like, for example, I got an email about Adina Saslovich's Tefillah yesterday. Okay, I got an email yesterday where somebody said, I lost my mom this year, a couple months ago, and I've been in agony and I've been suffering. And I opened up as Nashir and I read Adina Saslovich's Yizkor for her mother. And I felt like she was standing next to me and she understood me. And also all of a sudden I had language for tefillah that I didn't have. And it was about the universality of access, is that I wanted to make sure, and we had many conversations about this, that any woman who was looking for that particular tefillah could relate to it, that the particularities are not important in the sense of what the purpose is. The purpose is prayer. So are they important in the scheme of life? Absolutely. That's details. Any good writing is the richness is in the details. That being said, it had to be open enough so that we could project our own needs and yearning onto them. And so it actually didn't even come up because that wasn't the goal this time.
The bios are in the back.
It's a good idea though, Shalamis. Maybe next time. Next time. All right. It's a good idea.
For the 1,000 page book.
Any other questions before we close?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. Thank you for coming.
The books are in the back.
Yeah, thank-